Hello everyone, Grim here, and welcome to my nightmare. Today's nightmare is a bit different from normal, as I'm going to be telling you several true ghost experiences to help you fall asleep. There will be some that bring out the deepest fear in some people, but in others will help them relax, so please listen at your own discretion. I won't drag this out forever, but I will let you know that I intend to have some rain playing on the background towards the end, just to help those in the final stages have their head rest and finally be at peace. So, sit back, relax, and sleep. I've experienced many supernatural occurrences throughout my life, and I believe it is due to both sides of my family having multiple family members with gifts. This experience was way back in my childhood. I was about 6 to 7 years old. It just started happening one day out of nowhere. I began having these very vivid dreams, and in them there was always this shadowy figure, a malevolent one that seemed masculine because of its voice and demeanor. This shadowy figure was always chasing me in my dreams, and then one night I remember an extremely frightening encounter with the thing. It had me cornered in my bedroom, and then it threw me into my bed and held me to it. I was paralyzed. Fear vibrated through my body. This shadow figure whispered in my ear, "As you grow, the more powerful you'll become. One day, I'll come for you." I woke up screaming so loudly and so intensely that I swear my whole bed shook. My room was freezing, and my parents busted through the door, which was locked when I swear it never was. They were frantic and asked what happened, and I explained to them, and I remember my mother having this strange look on her face. It was worry, but also something else. It really had me scared. Even worse, I had bruises on both of my arms where the shadow figure had held me down on my bed. My mother sat me down the next morning and explained to me that when she was a young girl in Vietnam, she would see spirits everywhere, and it was tough for her because a lot of these spirits looked like normal living people to her, and so she would occasionally interact with them. Other people in her village would give her weird looks and would talk about her and our family. She said she got her gift from her mother, my grandmother, who could also see spirits. She explained to me that one evening while walking home from school, she felt this dark, cold energy around her. She suddenly fainted. She remembers seeing this entity while passed out, and that it had tried to possess her, but that she was thankfully wearing a protection amulet of some sort given to her by a priest who was a family friend. Once my mother left Vietnam and came over to the US, she married an American man, my father. My father has family with a history of paranormal and supernatural experiences. My mother told me that on my father's side a few aunts and uncles have gifts as well, but one aunt in particular was quite strong in her gift. My mother told me my aunt might know what was happening to me and could possibly help. The very same day my mother contacts my aunt and she arrives at our house. We talk and my auntie decided that she should do a sort of reading ritual to see what was happening with the house and with me. I remember her having me lay on the ground in my bedroom with all these candles and incense and a strange looking circle with symbols drawn with herbs. She began chanting something in Vietnamese and suddenly the room got very cold and I got lightheaded. Then I blacked out. When I came to, I noticed my aunt and mother at the bedroom door whispering to each other. My aunt then came back to the center of the room to talk with me. She asked if I had ever seen or talked to anyone that my parents hadn't met, especially recently. I told her that I had befriended this little girl behind the house who frequently walked through the alley. This had been happening for about a month and a half of just seeing this little girl wandering back and forth through the alleyway, never telling me anything about herself, where she came from, what her parents did for a living, where in the neighborhood she lives, etc. But she seemed friendly and we talked about all sorts of things and it was nice having someone to talk with. My aunt had me describe the little girl to her. The strangest thing was, when she asked for the little girl's name, I couldn't remember it. I remember she told me a few times, but for some reason I just couldn't remember and say it. My aunt decided to have me take her to the backyard where the alleyway was, and she observed me from inside a shed. I walked up to the fence and I called for the little girl, and sure enough, she appeared. We talked and then she left. I walked into the shed and my aunt had this terrified expression on her face. She grabbed me and brought me into the house and talked to my mother and told her what she had saw. It turns out what appeared to be a little girl to me, my aunt saw as a huge, black, misty shadow figure. It was radiating so much negative energy. She had not encountered anything like it before. She knew about it and explained to me that since both sides of my lineage had family members with gifts and abilities, and the fact that I was born from a combination of both family lines, that I would be and was manifesting some of my own. And because of that, I was inadvertently drawing the supernatural to me. Basically, I was a magnet of energy, and everything supernatural was being attracted to me. My aunt then proceeded to tell me that from her reading and ritual earlier, at the time I was manifesting the gifts and abilities to see and dream of the supernatural. She said I had to be careful and aware of the supernatural, as they tend to be more often than not malicious. She said whatever malevolent entity was interacting with me was trying to force a piece of itself into me, to nurture and grow until it was time to harvest. I was beyond freaked out and was crying, and all of it was too much. My aunt then talked with my mother and said that there was a ritual that could help ward off the malevolent entity trying to mess with me. My aunt left and returned the next day with boxes filled with supplies for this ritual. Once I was in my bedroom laying on the floor, candles, incense, weird symbols drawn with herbs all over the place, my auntie chanting in Vietnamese. I remember this unbelievable pain on my lower back. It was a searing heat, like fire was being directly applied to my skin. My aunt dipped her hands in this bowl filled with these oils and herbs and placed them onto my back, and I could just feel her tracing things all over me. This went on for what felt like half an hour, then it just stopped. The pain was gone, and, of course, I passed out. I woke up hours later, and my aunt explained to me that she had placed a rather serious protection spell on my body and soul, as it was the only way to make sure the malevolent entity couldn't get to me anymore. I believed it worked. Never saw that figure or the little girl it masqueraded as ever again. Years later, I came to find out why the protection spell was so serious. My aunt told me it required her to extract some of her own soul to power it. The other thing was that it would dampen my abilities, so I guess I could have a normal life. In 2013, my wife and I divorced, and we both moved on into separate homes. The divorce went well, and we are still good friends to this day, partially because we share a daughter together. We agreed to split custody for our daughter, and I rented an old house in a historic district in the city that we used to live in. It was a very pretty home, built in 1935, but kept up really well. I would have my daughter 2 weeks at a time, and she had her own bedroom in the back of the house. She was 3 years old at the time, and I kept noticing her talking to her friend. One day I found her in a little closet talking to someone, and I remember her saying she was talking to another little girl named Betty. I have no idea where she learned the name Betty, as she was only 3 years old, but I just chalked it up to a child's vivid imagination. Keeping in mind I am a single dad to a little girl, I really have no idea what I'm doing when it comes to things such as dressing her or taking care of her hair, or, to be fair, little girl stuff in general. Her mother, though, she is good at that stuff, but not me. I put my daughter to bed one night after her bath. I remember brushing her hair that night, but that was all I did. However, the next morning her mum came to pick her up from my house. My daughter was just waking up. So her mum went to her bedroom to find that my daughter's hair was fixed into 2 perfect French braids. Her mum was so proud of me at first that I had done her hair so cute, but I told her that I didn't and couldn't do that. I can't even braid her hair, much less do perfect French braids. We asked our daughter how her hair got fixed, and she told us that Betty had done it during the night. Needless to say, I broke the contract on that rental agreement and moved out within the next month. So, let me start by saying I enjoy talking, so this will be long, but I will hopefully be able to entertain you, and it'll be an interesting story. I also admit that I have absolutely no memory of this experience. I was a little over 2 years old at the time and just started walking on my own when this event had taken place. My mum told me the story around 3 years ago when I was 32 and just about to get married. My mother was raised in a very tiny, fundamentalist Christian community and had no belief in the paranormal. She believed that our souls slept until Judgment Day or something like this. Ergo, there are no ghosts or spirits to haunt houses. Even over 30 years later, she still sounded terrified as she told me about this. This woman who always talks way too loud was literally whispering by the end of it, and she was as white as a sheet. I believe her completely, and I still do. My mother never talks about stuff like this, so I'm just glad that I can remember it. In 1988, my parents had their second child. This was my brother, Victor. We were very crowded in our rented flat with 2 babies, so my parents decided to move to a rambling old 2-story farmhouse on a 7-acre plot in southern Idaho for more room for the family. It was way out in the sticks and took almost an hour to get to town from there. My mum said that the first time that I saw the house I freaked out. I was crying and saying things like, "Don't like, mean house," or "mean house, ugly house, don't like, scary house, mama, don't like." My mum says that this behavior was very out of character for me, but I stopped complaining about the house after a few weeks, so she chalked it up to the stress of the move. Now this house was ramshackle as hell and in the middle of nowhere. The kitchen was to the far rear of the house, and until recently, before we moved in, still had a working, ancient wood-burning cooking stove set up against the back wall. Unfortunately, this had caught fire a while back and set the back wall alight, causing a lot of damage. A lot of this damage wasn't fixed, so my young broke parents got a very cheap rent agreement. Gotta love the 80s. On the second floor, directly above the kitchen, was a locked door. The landlord claimed that the room had heavy fire damage, but her son, who had done the repairs, claimed that the only fire damage left was in the kitchen, since it had been the worst and was beyond his skill levels to fix. Either way, The landlord was adamant that that room was off limits, and my parents always respected that. In all honesty, I would have looked like 100%. I know all of this because I heard stories about the crappy farmhouse with the creepy door my whole life, and there were loads of pictures of us in and around the farmhouse. The locked door was right next to the upstairs landing, so there was no avoiding it, and both my parents have told me it gave them the creeps. A few months after we moved in, and my mother and I were in the yard with our pit bull Doberman mix called Boss. She was hanging the laundry, and I was rolling around with the dog. She said that just as she noticed that everything was way too silent, Boss started going apeshit from surprisingly far away, about 500 yards from the house on the left. There was a small duck pond. Boss was in between the two, running towards my mum and then running back towards the pond, barking frantically the whole time. My mother saw something thrashing around in the middle of the pond. She took off towards the water full speed, Boss beating her there and then dragging me out of the water himself. Although my mum was confused about how I got so fast and how I got into the center of the pond, since it was well and truly over my head and I couldn't swim, she just figured that she underestimated me and brought in the baby gates and playpens. I was to be contained from now on. A few weeks later, she was cooking downstairs. Boss was outside. Victor asleep in his crib, and I was in my playpen in my room upstairs. I also had a gate on my door and one at the top of the stairs. The stairs ran up from the side of the kitchen, so my mum said she could listen for us crying or fussing while cooking. My mum said no longer than 15 minutes after the last time she looked in on us kids, Boss started going crazy again in the yard. She runs up to check on us. Victor is still sleeping and every baby gate is still shut and locked, but I am not in my room. A frenzied search reveals that I'm not in the house at all. A sudden image of Boss saving me from drowning causes my mum to rush outside to see what he is trying to tell her this time. She said he was running circles around the yard, barking uncontrollably. When she got outside, he took off towards the right, away from the pond. He would run ahead, turn around and bark at my mother, wait for her to catch up a little before racing off again. He ended up leading her almost 1.5 miles out into the dirt road that separated our property from our neighbors. He led her to a thick stand of trees on our neighbor's side of the rocky drive. She said what hit her first was the foul stench of advanced decay. She plowed into the trees with her heart in her throat and her stomach full of ice. She said she noticed many piles of corrugated tin, trapped tires, and other debris. The miasma was emanating most strongly from these junkyard cairns. Peeking under a sheet of tin, she discovered the extremely decomposed corpse of a butchered cow. As she headed deeper into the thicket where the cover was denser, she said less care was taken to cover the remains. Grisly pieces of bone and rotted chunks of bovine littered the area. Apparently, our neighbor, in an effort to cheat his taxes, had been illegally slaughtering cattle and hiding the remains in at least one of the few thick stands of trees around. She found me in the dead center of this thicket, just standing there looking around like I was confused, surrounded by carnage. She said I didn't seem scared or anything, just standing. She rushed over to me and, after ascertaining that I wasn't injured, began questioning me on why I was there or how I had gotten there, etc. Keep in mind that although my mother said I started speaking very young, I still didn't have much of a vocabulary. She said I told her with that serious look only small children can give that the children brought me there. Shitting her pants at the thought that anyone, even children, could walk right past her through the kitchen, get me from upstairs, and walk right back past her on the way down the stairs and out with me. She demanded to know what children and where the hell they are now. I looked at her dead serious and told her the ones that live with us in the room at the top of the stairs, and that I don't see them anymore. After a moment of stunned silence, she started asking me all kinds of questions about these children. However, she told me that I refused to say anything else. She said as long as she questioned me about what happened, I would just stand there staring at her with a serious expression and my mouth closed. She said the same pattern held true every other time she brought it up to me. So she was always left wondering and immediately began hounding my father to move closer to town. While the incident of me getting into the center of the pond was highly unlikely, it was at least remotely possible. But my mother is adamant that there is no way me being hidden in a slaughter yard that day was at all possible. She says there's no way I could have even known that it was out there, much less have the ability to open and relock the baby gates, get downstairs past her and end up 2 miles down the road and in this place in under 15 minutes. I was only 2 and as slow and clumsy as most toddlers. As I said, she still seems shaken by this after 30 years. Personally, I have no idea what happened that day. I've thought about hypothesis, but haven't yet decided. I really want to remember, but maybe it's better to let it to continue to be a mystery. Because whatever the fuck those things were, I really don't think that they were children. I bought my first house in 2003 and was over the moon. Shortly after moving in, 2 of my neighbors began joking with me about the ghost in my house. Well, at least I thought they were joking, so I just played along, pretending that I had seen one and that it was no big deal. Well, as time went on that summer, I met more and more of my neighbors, and they all brought up the same topic. Finally, an older woman on the block who was quite kind and friendly told me the story after I asked her. I knew she wasn't going to screw with my head, which was why I asked her in the first place. It turned out the previous owner purchased the home and never lived there because she said it was haunted. Sounds in the night of footsteps and sobbing and glimpses of a man sitting in the kitchen covered in blood. One of my neighbors helped with the renovations, in the house and said that he was putting up drywall when he felt something lift up his dreadlocks. Though I have had paranormal experiences before, it had been years, and by then I just chalked them up to being night terrors. One day I went to a small neighborhood video store to rent a movie. I had to fill out the form with my demographic data and my credit card information. The owner of the store looked at the form and said, "Oh my God, you live in that house?" I asked her what she meant, and she explained that her former employee had committed suicide in my house. She came to the old house as soon as she heard, but the house had been taped off by the police as a potential crime scene. She told me that he had just moved into the house with his partner and called his mum because he wanted to invite her over to meet his partner and come out to her. This was the early 90s when being gay was a really big deal. His mother already knew he was gay because he bought a house with a man and then she disowned him right over the phone. That same week he received a letter from an HIV testing centre stating that he had tested positive for HIV. This was back when HIV was a death sentence. He sat at the kitchen table, ate a bowl of cereal, and then shot himself in the head with a revolver. Since then, she's had multiple paranormal experiences in the store, videos flying off the shelves and even levitating. The most I have experienced is the sounds at night, the sounds of cereal being poured into a bowl, even though I don't own cereal, and the sound of sobbing in the kitchen. I often awaken to both. I remember my grandmother saying, "When the dead come to you, they want something. Perform an act of charity in their name and pray for them." So I did. I sat down in the kitchen at the table one night and lit a candle and told him that each night I would recite a novena prayer for him before I lit a candle. On the 9th night of the first novena to Saint Anthony, the patron saint of lost souls, I heard uncontrollable sobbing. I felt a strong presence of grief and despair and the sound of hyperventilated breathing. It was as though someone could not catch their breath. I sat in the presence of this, knowing that it was not malignant, but rather a connection of intimacy and compassion of which he was in need of. For 45 days I said a novena prayer before I lit a candle for his soul, and had a mass said in his name. A few times I had awoken to feel his presence standing over my bed, but I knew it was not a malignant presence. This still happens from time to time, but it is getting less and less frequent. In the early 80s, I lived in Okinawa, Japan. My dad thought that seeing the world would be an adventure that would help my brother and I become better men, and I have to say, I think he was right. Being in the military showed me cultures many would never get to experience, and I am thankful for every experience that life gave me, even the scary ones. While we lived in Japan, my father wanted us to have a fully immersive experience, so he chose to move us to a small Japanese neighborhood that was off base. We lived in a little house at the top of an enormous hill in a cul-de-sac that overlooked, and I kid you not, part of a huge zoo and one side of a fairly large cemetery. Our particular house was set far above the monkey habitats, about a mile down the hill. Between us and those habitats was nothing but a thick Indian Jones-style forest, a jungle that the neighborhood kids and I would thomp through endlessly, ignoring all the local warnings about poisonous snakes and ancient untripped mines from World War II. We were the only American family living in the cul-de-sac, completely surrounded by Japanese families, and it was amazing. The kids loved us, and although we couldn't communicate through language very well, we understood each other perfectly. Most of the time. Opposite us was an older couple with a lush garden surrounding their property. The older woman wanted us to call her Mama-san, and she had us helping her garden whenever she could coax us over with some green tea and chocolate banana cookies. We loved her. She was so welcoming and generous, as was everyone else actually. We lived in a wonderful neighborhood. The only drawback to Mama-san's house, however, was that she directly overlooked the cemetery, and that cemetery was unlike any cemetery I had ever seen before. Because Okinawa is an island, burials don't happen very often. Instead, above-ground crypts are built. Many of them are built into the sides of the hills that make up the island. The crypts are large, made of huge arcs of polished stone set over a large square of that stone, which has a square insert cut into the middle so that a coffin can be placed inside. Once the coffin is inside, a square that is inserted with another piece of polished stone that sits just inside, leaving a kind of shelf on the outside so that offerings could be made to lost loved ones. Yen, food, flowers, incense, and some other offerings are given. Below Mama-san's house was a valley that swooped back up onto another hill opposite her home. The valley and both hills were covered with these crypts, and spider webbing up and down through the crypts were various stone step pathways that were old and badly maintained. It was quite a sight. One evening, Mother-san asked me to come visit her alone. She had something to show me, but it was only for me as the older brother. Intrigued and a bit proud, I agreed. She took me to the back of her garden and sat me on a thick wooden bench that was carved with scenes of fishermen and men with swords. She told me she had a story to tell. Mama-san then disappeared for a few minutes and soon returned with a tray that held a hot green tea and sweet rice cakes. Sitting next to me, she smiled and commented on the color of the evening sky as the sun began to lower. Mama-san said she had seen me, my brother, and some other kids daring each other to follow a stairway path through the cemetery. You have to understand, the path from our little home area down to the cemetery consisted of hundreds of steps, many broken or cracking, in and or out of bushes and at steep declines. It would be dangerous for anyone, but a real test was seeing how long it would take for us to walk through the crypts at night. Mama-san wanted to explain why that was a bad idea. Many years ago, during the war, Americans were thought to be devils. Monsters that would murder innocent citizens for no reason other than to kill. That fear was the product of wartime propaganda used to encourage young men to military service and farmers to fight alongside them. But many didn't. Many ran, and with nowhere to go, nowhere to hide, hundreds of Japanese citizens hurled themselves off of a cliffside rather than to face the torture at the hands of their perceived enemy. I was terrified at hearing this. I had no idea this had happened. I was mortified and hit with such sadness that I started to cry. The sun was setting and the sky went from pink and blue to a deep orange and red. Mama-san reached out and held my hand, telling me not to worry. This was in the past, and the past is something we must always remember so that we never go back. She went on with her story. One young woman had followed through with this sacrifice with her 2 children in tow, but unfortunately she survived the fall. She was in a coma for months. When she did finally regain consciousness, she was horrified to realize she was not with her children. They had been buried somewhere in that cemetery below in an unmarked crypt that held many others. The woman would spend days and nights searching the cemetery, crying in pain, the torment of her loss unbearable, until the day she threw herself into the ocean to hopefully be reunited with her family. But they say she never found her children. Her act of suicide doomed her to purgatory. She would remain tortured for eternity. The sun had disappeared, the cemetery drowned in an inky blackness, the main path dotted with dim broken lights feebly illuminating the areas. Mama-san continued. She still wanders, she said, looking for her kids. You can hear her crying. And then she pointed down. I didn't want to look, but I did. I looked in the back of the cemetery. In the darkness, there was a white figure. At first, a bright white shimmer, moving slowly, kind of shaking. It moved from side to side like it was among the crypts, and I could actually hear it crying. Softly at first, but then low moans and whimpers of pain as it got closer. I was terrified. I wanted to run, but Mama-san held my hand and whispered that she wouldn't come up here. We were too far, but that is why we shouldn't go down there after dark. She said many don't know her story and call her the White Witch, which angers her, so it is best to stay away. It is just best to pray for her. Mama-san said she comes out to see her often, hoping that one day she'll find her salvation. Needless to say, I never went down to that cemetery, not once, and I never sat back there with Mama-san again either. That was enough for me. I did, however, visit Suicide Hill. It's called Peace Prayer Park now out of respect. I cried the whole time while we were there. I prayed for all the souls and for forgiveness. So many Japanese citizens spoke to us, welcoming us, telling us stories, sharing with us. I didn't feel worthy, and my love for the country and its people was overwhelming. I'll never forget my time there, and I'd like to go back to see if it's still there, to see if she's still there, wandering in the graves, looking for her children. Hello. I'm new to the subreddit, and I've always wanted to tell my story to someone or share it in some place that would actually listen to me. First off, I feel like I have to say this beforehand, that this type of game is not the Charlie challenge. First off, it's actually real, and a little more complicated. Okay, so I got this game from a childhood friend in middle school. Her family come from Spain, so I thought I might have to add that as well. What you need for the game is as follows. A pen or pencil, either will do. A strip of paper that is as thick as about 2 fingers in width. A quiet room where people aren't there to bullshit and actually take it seriously, since this will never work if they don't take it seriously. Here are the rules. There can only be up to 6 people in the room, including the person doing the act. Again, make sure these people are the only ones taking this seriously. The person doing the task has to sit on the floor in the center of the room. The pen or pencil's pointer has to point in the opposite direction from the person doing the act. No one is allowed to touch any of the supplies being used before, during, and or after the game besides the person doing the game. Or else bad luck will happen to not only the person who touched it, but the player as well. How to play. Wrap the paper around the pencil. How you wrap it is by making a U shape with the paper and then placing the pencil at the bottom on the U. Pinch the paper to fit the pencil base, then bend the paper to the side and wrap the remaining paper around it. This should fit the pencil base, then bend the paper to the side and wrap the remaining paper around it. There should be 2 ends of the paper after you have successfully wrapped it to pull on later. Set the pencil down on the ground in front of you with the pointer side not facing you. Be very careful not to unwrap the paper while doing so. After that, hold your dominant hand over the pencil and hover it above it. As the player, say, lovely ghost, will you play a game with me? Please answer with a yes or no. Hold your hand over the pencil, wrapped in paper, for 20 to 30 seconds. If you hear the paper shifting on its own, then that's a good sign. Do not touch the pencil wrapped in paper during this process. Once you've waited, carefully pick up the paper-wrapped pencil and hold on to the end of the wrapped paper. Again, make sure you wrapped it correctly so that the two ends of paper are the ones you should hold on to. Hold to unwrap it. If the paper is no longer wrapped around the pencil, this means yes, and the game has begun. Please note, while playing this game, you can only ask questions that have yes or no answers. If it doesn't come off and stays perfectly wrapped around, then that means no, and you'll have to try again. If you get a yes, after 5 to 10 minutes of playing, you have to say, lovely ghost, thank you for playing with me. May I leave the game?" Please answer with yes or no. And if they say yes, by having the paper come off, then you may successfully leave the game. Use the same thing when you want to leave the game after you've already entered it. If they say no when you've asked to leave, you have to keep playing or else bad luck and creepy things will happen to every single person in that room, including the player. Do you get the gist of it? Well, because of this game, I've had many moments along with the people playing the game come from it, so here are a few. 1. While sleeping, I could feel my mattress shift, and it feels like someone is slowly crawling on top of me, and I feel a heavy presence above me. When this happens, I never open my eyes, and yes, I could move fine. I wanted to make sure it wasn't sleep paralysis, of course. Number 2, I've had some loud whispering directly in my ear, where they would whisper in my ear while I was sleeping. The only other person in the room was my sibling at the time, and they were in their own bed on the opposite side of the room, dead asleep. Number 3, multiple doors either slamming shut or slowly opening while there's no draft, window or person in the house to open them. Number 4, items around the house going missing when I knew exactly where they were just moments earlier, or I had them in my hands and set them down beside me and then have it randomly show up in my closet or on my desk or on the floor near the closet. Number 5, having a dream where a shadow person comes from behind my closet to my bed and watches me and then strokes my face. I wake up each time that I have that dream in cold sweats. The side of my face where it was stroked is icy cold. Once I had a mirror behind my closet that my family kept when we moved in to an older apartment. That mirror was the only thing left behind from the previous owners, and, well, I don't have that mirror anymore, so I don't think it really matters because I still get those dreams from time to time. That's just some of the things that have happened to me personally. As for the people that were in the room when we did this game, I've asked them, and if they had anything happened, and in fact a few of them had. A few weeks after, sometimes it was months, but they had things randomly happen, like moments where they felt watched or had things from time to time seem to randomly disappear and then reappear in several scenarios. They too had that common occurrence of doors opening and closing. I haven't played the game since I was 16 or so, and now I'm 22. But every time I ask someone about it, if they know the game, they just say that they've never heard of it. So, I guess I'm hoping when I post this here that the people of Reddit who know may be able to tell me more about it and help me learn about some of the things, since doing research on my own isn't helpful, as I can barely find anything in my searches. Besides that, I thought I would say I have more experiences with this, but I don't want to write a whole book. So, at this point, I'll just leave it where it is, but if anyone has any questions about it, I'll do my best to answer them. Thank you to the people who took the time to read this story. It means a lot, truly, and I hope you have a nice evening. This is not my first time posting about this, but I just felt I should share because it's happened again, but this time it was so much more demonic, and this time I saw something. This happened to me last night. It was about an hour after everyone had turned in for the night, so roughly 11 p.m., maybe 11:30. I'm not sure, but it was somewhere around that time. I was working on a custom I started a few days ago when I heard a man that sounded like my father yelling my name from outside of the house. It was just like the last time, except it sounded closer to my room than it had been the last time. I mean, it started in the backyard, but not by the garage like last time. This time, they did the same where it went around the house and seemed to have gotten inside, but this is where it starts getting demonic. Instead of first hearing my mother scream followed by my aunt and Nana, it was all of them at once, and they seemed to be screeching at the exact same time. It sounded like all the screams were coming from the same creature. They had to be, as they were too unison. They were too in sync to be coming from separate beings, and I no longer heard a man's voice. All I heard was the still in sync and now starting to be distorted screeches, following with distorted cries of my mother, aunt and Nana combined. Soon the scream stopped. I then heard something in my backyard, and despite my common sense, I looked out my window. Of course, classic white person in a horror movie trope, right? I saw what at first glance looked like a homeless woman that somehow got into my backyard. I thought maybe she was just trying to hide. She was on her knees, leaning forward, and I thought she was crying. I mean, it sounded like she was crying. But then I noticed something bone-chilling. Even though that woman was on her knees leaning downwards, she was almost the same height as me, and I'm 5'7". It was at this point that I realized this creature, this being, it wasn't human. and everything fell silent. That thing then took in a deep inhale and let out a demonic laugh. The laugh sounded like the screams from earlier. It was laughing as though the laughs were that of my mother, my aunt, and my nana, all in sync, and they were horrifically distorted. I grabbed a knife that I had in my room and ran back to my window at what felt like the speed of light. That monster was now facing my window, crouched down, still leaning downwards and still laughing. It didn't stop laughing for a second. It then looked up at me, now laughing through its teeth, and it saw me. I was frozen, paralyzed in fear. All I could do was look. Then another one of them leaped over the fence that separated my backyard from the backyard of someone that I used to be friends with. This creature, this one, it was male, I think. It had the skin and torn clothes of one, but had to at least be 8 to 11 feet tall, and I just stood there and looked at them, their skin falling off their bones, eyes frosted over and just too big for their faces. They were just staring at me. I just stood there for what felt like hours, but in reality must have only been minutes. I looked, and they looked at each other and then back to me. I was still frozen, but now tears were falling down my face. They then turned around and left. I was then able to move again, so I darted to the other side of my room and flipped on the lights. I sat on my bed, still holding the knife. I nervously put my knife on the dresser, which is next to my bed, and laid down. I then looked at my clock and realized all this had happened in about 30 minutes, and the clock just read 12:03 a.m. I didn't fall asleep until 2 a.m. When I woke up at 6, I saw that I had all these bruises on my leg. Now, there's no way I could have done this to myself. I'm not strong enough to make a bruise that big, that bad. I remember that 2 people replied to my first post, and I thought that maybe they were right and it was a skinwalker. I didn't really know what they were talking about, as I had never heard of one, so earlier today I looked up what skinwalkers were, and I think they're right. I'm scared that they want to kill me, to take my skin. I'm scared to go to bed tonight. I only have 6 hours until then. Since my bedtime is at 10 p.m, I'm terrified of what's gonna happen. Please wish me luck, and hopefully I get to live through the night. I'm about to be 24 years old, and I have been battling with spirits since I was 7 years old. Even though it was 17 years ago, it still feels like yesterday. It all happened on a beautiful sunny day. Everyone was out except for my mom and I. She was folding laundry in the bedroom at the back of our house, and I was reading a book in my bedroom in the front. Other than her TV, which I could hear, there was no other electronics in the house. Deep into my book, I started hearing this strange, raspy breathing. It was a very old house, so I thought it was just the house doing what old houses do, and I tried ignoring it. The more I ignored it, the more louder and persistent it got, till it got so loud it sounded like a megaphone was in my room. Specifically, it sounded like a haggard old woman breathing angrily. By this point, I was so terrified I was frozen in fear, but I finally got a surge of energy, threw my book on the ground, jumped off my bed and ran into the hallway towards my mum's room. Running into the hallway was more than horrific. We had high ceilings and stone floors, so the breathing was not only amplified, but it was bouncing all over the place. It was so chaotic that I thought I was going crazy. Not only was the noise wild, but my body was so out of whack too. My sense of perception was way off, and I was tripping over my feet. Everything even looked topsy-turvy. When I finally made it into my mum's room, that's where the real horror was. She had been sitting at the edge of her bed, folding a giant pile of laundry earlier, and when I ran into her room, she was passed out in the same position she had been sitting in, except she was splayed on top of the laundry as if someone hit her in the back of the head, and she blacked out on top of the laundry. I couldn't believe my eyes. I didn't know what to do. I just jumped on her bed, forced my eyes shut, and then blacked out from fear. When I woke up, I really thought it was a horrific nightmare. There was no way this could have been real, but then I walked into my room and there was the book, exactly where I threw it. I was 7 years old. I was not on any medication, and I definitely did not do drugs. I didn't play with Ouija boards. I didn't do anything that could induce spirits. I have always been spiritual, so that is the only explanation I can think of as to why it started. This was the start of my ghost issues. They happen every couple of years, but thankfully they haven't been a daily issue. My second real horror story came after something I did, sadly. This time I did play with an Ouija board, and I got physically hurt. There is a reason they tell you not to play with them. It is not a silly game. This actually happened when I was around 16, so it was much later, but anyway, a girlfriend and I decided to play the Ouija board and then later watch TV. The game itself wasn't significant, and I can't remember if it worked or not, but later on it definitely did. We were spooning on the couch watching TV, and I was being the big spoon when I felt a quick, deep, painful burning sensation on my side that was pressed against the couch. It hurt so bad that I jumped up and screamed out in pain. We had just had a flea outbreak, so I thought it was that, but then I lifted my shirt and there was a claw mark with 3 deep marks and 3 very faint ones, so it had 6 fingers. Not only that, it was creepy and tiny. I myself am quite small, only 95 pounds, and my hand is also quite small. But compared to my hand, this was miniature. The whole 6 fingers were about the width of 3 of mine. There was no way it could have been my hand too, because the scratches, their lines were evenly spaced. It was obvious. 6 separate claw marks, evenly spaced, miniature size, had happened at the exact same time. I had taken pictures and I would have shown them, but they got lost when I broke my computer. I even had them on a photo bucket, but then that got mysteriously deleted. Anyway, later that day my friend and I are in the bedroom with my door wide open and we're conversating, and my back is in the hallway while she is facing it. She's in the middle of speaking when she gets super pale and wide-eyed. I ask her what's wrong and she says that there's a huge black shadow staring at us from the hallway. It was gone when I turned around, but that didn't stop her from grabbing her purse and just running out of my house right then and there, and she didn't come back. It was so embarrassing. After this situation, things started getting really, really weird around the house, but it only ever seemed to happen to me. Though my dad and roommate lived there, no one noticed anything. One day, my ex and I were laying on the bed watching TV with my comforter around my knees. When I moved my legs slightly over, I felt something wet. I was confused because my bed was in the middle of the room and there was nothing around that could have made it wet. So I proceeded to lift the covers, and right there was a perfectly round, soaking wet puddle of about a foot in diameter. My boyfriend and I were speechless and shocked. Earlier that day, when I opened my walk-in closet, a breeze had come out, which was strange because it didn't have any vents or windows, but my boyfriend and I decided to inspect it one more time, just thinking that it had something to do with the wet bed. We walked over to the closet. There was nothing there, and so we walked back onto my bed. In that span of 30 seconds, the puddle of water had completely dissipated. Not only that, it left a strange stain, almost like how oil looks when it stains and dries. So this couldn't have been water, no matter how many times I washed these sheets. That perfectly round stain always remained. And remember, the bed was in the middle of the room, so there was absolutely no water around. One more thing about my room. It was on the second story, so any sort of excuse that a pipe may have burst and fell onto my bed doesn't work, and on that day it wasn't raining either. In the same house I experienced strange problems with electronics, even though that is a regular problem with me, even to this day. But in this house, the TV would never be on the channel I turned it off on. This only ever happened to me, but it was so regular that I deemed it normal. My room was also the only room that received blackouts, which also happened regularly, even though there were 4 other rooms in the house. When I was alone at home, my whole house actually got blackouts too. The most significant time I remember is when I was sitting in my living room at home alone one night, and my house had a 2-story wide open plain and a hallway you could see around from the living room. Anyways, I heard that this weird sound, like a mechanical sound almost, like a switch that had been switched, and The whole house was like a machine that got turned on. It was coming from the belly of the house, if that makes any sense. But anyway, after that noise turned on, the power started turning off. Even though it was pretty quick and the whole house wasn't instantaneous, it started in the right side of the house and then everything started to switch off one by one. It was the strangest blackout of my life. The lights turned back on right after and I was so confused and shocked when it actually happened. So, there I was alone, at home with creepy shit happening. A couple more things happened at that house, but those were the craziest things. Until recently. A couple of months ago I was making a video about this creepy video that I had found on the Bet website with Kanye at 2015 Honor Awards. His shadow was completely upside down and people could argue that it was the panel and he was standing in front of it creating an illusion, but the other two hosts that stood in front of it didn't get the same effect. So I decided to make a video and that's when things got weird. At the time I didn't know how to record directly from my computer, so I decided to use my tablet to record the video. I didn't notice at the time, but the second I pointed my webcam at the video, it started glitching. The screen started getting distorted when I was speaking to my own webcam. The screen got distorted and then the light started flashing and of course I started freaking out, but it seemed like there was something intelligent in there with me, flashing whenever I reacted to it. The next day I decided I needed to have an EVP session and that's when I got a loud and clear no from what sounded like a young man. I don't know what to make of these situations, but they were pretty scary. Another thing that was brought to my attention was that when I was making a completely unrelated video, someone realized there was heavy panting in the audio. It isn't very loud and clear and the sounds like some young guy masturbating. It's not coming from my room though. It's very easy to tell that, but I will try to post the links later on, but if you guys can come to a conclusion as to how I can handle this, I'd love to get to know your theories and see what you think is going on. I am usually a skeptic when it comes to ghosts, but since living in a 100-year-old house, things have gotten weird. I've gotten used to the bumps and shadows, but one night, things just got super spooky. My wife was sleeping and I was laying in the bed in the dark reading a book on my phone, when suddenly the dogs began barking and I heard a series of hard thuds against the floor as if someone was walking down the hall with their work boots on. My wife must have heard it too because she lifted her head and asked what it was. We fell silent and again, it sounded as if someone had taken 3 slow steps down the hall. For a little context, at the end of the hall is a small built-on utility room that leads out to the backyard. We began thinking that maybe someone had come in through the back door.
The dogs were still alert when my wife asked me to pass her the pistol, and she got up to assess the situation. It sounded like someone started charging down the hall towards the room, scared the shit out of us. My wife ran out of the room with the dogs ready to shoot the first and ask questions later type of mentality, but there was no one there. Not a soul. For a little bit more context, before we rented this house, my mum rented it. And I told her about what happened, and she said that the same thing happened to her. She heard running down the hall in the middle of the night and stood by her bedroom door with a crowbar, only for no one to appear. Occasionally I still hear footsteps, but I ignore them now. Too bad I can't ignore when they whisper in my ear. As a kid, I lived with my mom in an old house divided into 4 apartments. We lived on the first floor, and the house was near a mortuary. All the time that we lived there, 20 years, in fact, my mum and I had many strange encounters with someone or something. Today I wanted to start telling my stories and begin with the one that may not be the scariest, but gives me headaches till this day. I had a canopy bed as a child, and my grandpa was the one who built it for me. I was very little, around 4 to 5. As a teen, I once went to a dollar store and found a unique dream catcher that fit perfectly between the curtains of my canopy bed. The dream catcher had a star macram in dark purple, and instead of feathers it had some kind of wind chime under it. It was very pretty, and I loved the dingling sound that it made every time I got into or out of bed. One day when I came home and went to my room, I noticed immediately that my dream catcher was gone. Only the ring and a piece of purple fabric hung between the curtains. The rest of my dream catcher was in pieces on my bed and throughout the room. The shine part was ripped apart and the macram was completely torn. It looked like a cat had gotten to have fun with it, but we didn't have a cat. It honestly felt like a crime scene to me and gave me chills. Later that day I did some research and found out that the star symbol is meant to drive out dark spirits. So maybe this dream catcher saved me or someone else in the house in a way that I never noticed. I still have no other explanation for this experience, but I would love to hear some of your stories.
I never think about this story much because I think back and wonder if I had a mental breakdown or maybe went insane for a few minutes. Lying in bed tonight, years later, I think I might as well post it on Reddit. I was sitting in the kitchen with my grandfather. I can't remember what I was doing there that night. Maybe fixing a tractor or something. I don't remember how the subject came about, but my grandpa, I'll call him Dave, started talking about his mother and how he still keeps some of her here to remember her. He then told me a story. He said he's only ever told a few people. She had lived in the upstairs bedroom around the time of her death. Even though she had been sick, I guess she had departed too early without saying goodbye or had their last words together. A few weeks after her death, he heard footsteps, things rolling around on the ground, things getting picked up and set down, stuff like that. Dave said she appeared at the edge of his bed near the door one night. He just saw a shadow that looked like his old mother around the time of her death and asked his girlfriend at the time to turn the lights on, and then she was gone. They turned the lights off and she was closer but still surrounded in darkness. She looked younger. The lights came on and off a few more times until my grandmother was pretty young and at the edge of their bed. Then she was gone forever. He said this was the first and last time he had seen her after she had died. Here's the actual ghost story. While he was telling me the story, I started to hear footsteps, things rolling around upstairs, the sounds people make when they're above you. I immediately got chills down my spine, started bugging the heck out. Then I heard a scraping noise coming from the darkness in the living room. I finally cut my grandpa off and said something to the likes of, "Do you hear that? I hear stuff upstairs." He said, "Maybe that's Mother saying hello." I didn't hang around for very long after that. I cried on the way home because the scraping noise sounded like sanding. It reminded me of my father who used to work on guns as a hobby. He passed away a year or two prior. Well, Dave has since passed away. I really miss that dude. My mum worked at a hospital in an operation theatre. Sometimes she had to work until late nights, having to sterilize utensils, etc. One day, she asked me to accompany her to her workplace at night. I suppose she left something behind or remembered to do something she didn't do earlier. So, off we went. We entered the place, and it felt really off to me. Upon entering, she noticed that the AC in the area had not been turned off, so she turned it off while nagging, accusing one of her colleagues not to have turned off the AC before leaving work. We went further back where she had to do something, and once done, we walked back to the entrance as we were about to leave. Right when we were passing by the AC, it switched right back on. We even heard the sound of the switch and the humming of the AC. I startled. I thought that was weird, but my mum didn't say a word. Rather, she just turned it back off and we walked as casually as we could to the lift. Once we were on the lift, Mum said, "Did you see what just happened with the AC?" I nodded, scared. I suppose the dead like it cold. I remember that moment to this day. It was the scariest thing ever. Luckily, Mum was around and she was cool as a cucumber. I guess that's the perk of having worked in a hospital with a morgue for a very long time. I just want to know if this is a mental illness or real paranormal activity. So, recently I was driving down the road, probably around 11 p.m. with my daughter in the car seat. She's under 2. To pick up her mother from work. While driving down the road with music playing and one of the windows down, I am always glancing in my windows and mirrors just to be aware of the road and everything around me, regularly checking my windows and mirrors. I glanced twice at my rear view mirror, and the second time what I saw almost made me swerve off the road into a tree. I looked in my mirror and saw a ghostly woman with long black hair and fair skin. She had dark eyes looking down at my baby in the child seat. And then she slid her face towards me, hair covering half. She was looking right at me in the mirror. After almost swerving off the road, I regained control of the car and looked straight ahead and told myself in my head, "Don't freak out, don't freak out, don't freak out. Don't look yet, don't look, don't look." After a couple of seconds, I glanced in the mirror again because my child's back there and she was gone. I instantly looked back ahead and I am scared but glad she was not there. Then instantly I turn around and feel behind my seat on the floor to make sure there's no real person hiding behind me in the back seats. There was nothing there, and I returned to driving to pick up my wife from her job. Surprisingly, this has not been the only thing happening to me lately. There have even been incidents where my wife has been having around our house too. Doors moving slightly, roof ladder hatch slamming randomly, this even after I checked how heavy the hatch was to make sure it couldn't be the wind. I even then screwed it straight into the wood, so technically it shouldn't even have been able to move if it was the wind. What makes me question if this is a mental illness is the fact a year ago, while I was driving around the road morning time at about 8 a.m, it sounded like a woman in my back seat had just yelled into my ear while I was driving down the road, almost causing me to swerve into oncoming traffic. But after I regained control, I instantly grabbed the volume knob to turn it down in case it was my speakers. But the volume was not even at 10. Instantly, I realized it wasn't my music and looked around my car to see if there was someone else outside, and there were barely any cars around. So, as you could expect, I'm always on edge when I'm driving now. I'm looking around constantly, trying to figure out if there's something actually going on or if I'm crazy. So, what do you think? Is this a mental illness, or am I being visited by a crazy ghost woman?
Firstly, I want to thank each and every one of you who've made it through to this very last tale. And I hope that each and every one of you managed to get a marvelous sleep. I won't drag this out very long. Please enjoy the rain and be safe wherever you are. Have a good sleep, and this is Grim signing off.